Seoul was a city of glass and steel, shimmering under the weight of a winter that felt colder than any in recent memory. But for Daehyun, the cold was simply a state of being. He stood at the entrance of the Grand Hyatt, the flashing lights of cameras bouncing off the pristine lapels of his bespoke black suit, his expression unreadable, carved from marble and silence. He was a man who commanded rooms without speaking, the head of the Kong Syndicate, a business empire built on shadows and absolute discipline, where mistakes were not forgiven and weaknesses were not exposed. They called him the Silent King, a man who had rejected every arranged marriage proposal, every social climber, and every beauty queen the elite circles of South Korea had thrown at him, because to Daehyun, affection was a liability he could not afford. The wind howled, cutting through the heavy wool of the coats worn by the entourage flanking him, but he did not flinch, his dark eyes scanning the perimeter with the detached precision of a predator ensuring his territory was secure. It was then that he saw the splash of light blue against the relentless white of the falling snow. A woman was walking, stumbling, really near the edge of the valet line, far from where the guests were being ushered into warm limousines. She was entirely out of place, a vivid anomaly in a world of gray and black. She was African American, her skin glowing with a richness that seemed to defy the bleak lighting of the street lamps, but her posture was broken, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She wore a light blue blouse and a beige skirt, professional and elegant, but horrifyingly inadequate for the freezing temperature, the thin fabric clinging to her shivering frame as the snow began to pile on her bare arms. Security moved to intercept her, viewing her as a disturbance, a piece of debris to be swept away from the VIP exit, and Daehyun watched, his hand halfway to his car door, pausing as he saw the exact moment her strength gave out. She didn't crumple dramatically. She simply folded, her knees hitting the ice with a silent thud, her body listing to the side like a flower snapped by a gale. The world seemed to slow down, the noise of the paparazzi fading into a dull hum as Daehyun made a decision that broke every protocol his security team followed. He didn't signal a guard. He moved himself. His polished shoes crunched heavily on the snow as he strode toward her, the distance closing in seconds, his breath visible in the biting air. When he reached her, she was barely conscious, her eyelashes fluttering against cheeks that were pale with hypothermia, her lips tinged with a dangerous shade of blue. He knelt, disregarding the slush soaking into his expensive trousers, and touched her arm. Her skin was like ice, terrifyingly cold. "Get the car," he ordered, his voice low and rough, a command that sent his head of security scrambling instantly. Daehyun scooped her up, her weight negligible in his arms, her head lolling against his chest, and for a fleeting second, he smelled something faint and sweet, like vanilla and rain, beneath the scent of the freezing city. He was the man who never cared, the man who walked away from desperation, yet here he was, carrying a stranger into the warmth of his armored sedan, the hem of her beige skirt trailing against his dark coat. The silence inside the penthouse clinic was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic beep of a monitor and the soft hum of the central heating system that kept the world outside at bay. Naomi woke to the smell of antiseptic and expensive linen, her mind foggy, trying to piece together the fractured memories of the night before, the humiliation of being fired from the catering staff for a spilled tray she hadn't dropped, the security guards escorting her out the back without her coat, the biting wind that felt like needles on her skin, and then the darkness. She sat up too quickly, a wave of dizziness forcing her back against the plush pillows, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized she was not in a hospital, but in a room that looked more like a five-star hotel suite converted into a medical bay. The door opened, and the man from her fading memory stepped in, looking just as imposing without his coat, his white shirt crisp, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. "You are awake," Daehyun stated, not a question but an observation, his voice devoid of warmth yet lacking the cruelty she had come to expect from men in suits. He stood at the foot of the bed, watching her with an intensity that made her want to pull the duvet higher, his gaze taking in her confusion and her fear without flinching. "You were hypothermic. My doctor says you are also malnourished and exhausted. If I had left you there another 10 minutes, your heart would have stopped." Naomi swallowed hard, her throat dry, her pride warring with the reality of her situation. She was broke, alone in a foreign country, and currently indebted to a man who looked like he owned the skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I didn't ask for help, she whispered, her voice raspy but steady, her chin lifting slightly in a reflex of defiance that she had honed over years of struggle. I will pay you back for the medical care. Just give me the bill, and I will leave. Dae-hyun's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something like amusement or irritation crossing his face at her assertion. He walked to the side of the bed, placing a glass of water on the nightstand with a deliberate, heavy clink. You have no coat, no job, and according to the ID my security team found, your visa is tied to an employment contract you likely just lost, he said, his words stripping away her defenses with brutal efficiency. You cannot pay me. Not with money, Naomi stiffened, panic rising in her chest, but he continued before her fear could take root. I do not run a charity, and I do not tolerate debts going unpaid. You need a place to recover, and I need an assistant who is not afraid of long hours or silence. You will work off what you owe. That is the deal. It wasn't an offer. It was a decree. He was trapping her, yet in his eyes, she saw no malice, only a rigid, practical solution to a problem he had decided to fix. He was binding her to him not out of kindness, but out of a need for order. Or so, he told himself as he turned to leave, refusing to acknowledge the strange, protective anger he felt at the thought of her returning to the snow. The transition into Dae-hyun's world was jarring, a shift from the chaotic struggle of survival to a life of regimented silence and terrifying luxury. Naomi was given a uniform, simple, elegant, professional, and a small room in the staff quarters of his massive estate, a place that felt more like a fortress than a home. Her role was nebulous at first, a mix of housekeeping oversight and personal assistance, tasks that kept her in his orbit, but rarely in his direct line of sight. The other staff members, men with hard faces and women who moved like ghosts, treated her with a mixture of suspicion and confusion. She was the outsider, the foreigner who had fallen from the sky into the boss's arms, and they didn't know if she was a guest or a servant. Naomi kept her head down, working with a ferocity that was born of desperation, scrubbing floors that were already clean and organizing files that were already straight, determined to prove that she was not a charity case. Dae-hyun watched her from the periphery, observing her through the glass walls of his office or from the balcony overlooking the main hall. He noticed the way she paused to rub her aching legs when she thought no one was looking, the way she ate her meals quickly as if expecting the plate to be taken away, and the way she never, ever complained. One afternoon, while he was reviewing shipping manifests in the library, she entered with a tray of tea, her movements hesitant. As she set the cup down, her hand trembled, a remnant of her illness, and a drop of hot liquid splashed onto the polished mahogany desk. Naomi froze, her eyes widening in horror, waiting for the shout, the reprimand, the dismissal that always followed mistakes in her past jobs. I'm sorry, I'll clean it, she stammered, reaching for a napkin, her breath hitching. Dae-hyun caught her wrist, his grip firm but not painful, stopping her frantic motion. The contact sent a jolt through the room, a sudden, sharp connection that froze them both. Leave it, he said, his voice dropping an octave, the roughness of it startling her. He wasn't looking at the spill. He was looking at her hand, his thumb brushing inadvertently against her pulse point, feeling the frantic rhythm of her heart. You are still shaking. You are not fully recovered. It was an accusation, but it lacked the bite of anger. He released her slowly, his eyes holding hers for a beat longer than necessary. Sit down. Drink the tea, Naomi blinked, confused. Sir, I sit, he commanded, gesturing to the chair opposite him. That is an order, she sat, sipping the tea he had been meant to drink, while he went back to his papers, the silence between them shifting from oppressive to something strangely companionable, the vast distance between the Mafia boss and the stray he had taken in shrinking by mere inches. The fragile peace Naomi had found was shattered the moment Director Choi arrived at the estate. A high-ranking associate within the syndicate's legal front, Choi was a woman of sharp edges and sharper words, a gatekeeper who viewed Dae-hyun not just as a boss, but as a prize she had been circling for years. She swept into the main hall with a retinue of assistants, her eyes immediately landing on Naomi, who was organizing a stack of correspondence on the side table. The disdain was instant and visceral. To Choi, Naomi was an eyesore, a stain on the pristine image of the organization, a foreigner who didn't belong in the inner sanctum of Korean high society. She walked past Naomi, deliberately knocking the stack of papers to the floor with the brush of her expensive handbag, not even pausing to apologize. "Clean that up," Choi said in Korean to one of her own assistants, speaking as if Naomi didn't exist, as if she were a piece of furniture that had been inconveniently placed. Naomi understood enough. The tone was universal. She knelt to gather the papers, her face burning with humiliation, her fingers fumbling with the sheets. "Who is this?" Choi asked Secretary Min, her voice loud enough to carry, dripping with venom. "Has the chairman started hiring street cleaners for the main house?" "It smells like desperation in here," the staff nearby stiffened, averting their eyes, knowing that Choi's cruelty was often unchecked due to her family's influence. Naomi bit her lip, holding back tears of frustration, her pride screaming at her to stand up, to say something, but the debt she owed kept her silent. She was trapped by her gratitude and her poverty, forced to swallow the insult. The heavy oak doors of the office swung open, slamming against the wall with a violence that silenced the room instantly. Dae-hyun stood in the doorway, his presence filling the space like a thundercloud. He had heard. He walked down the stairs, his steps slow and deliberate, the sound echoing like gunshots in the quiet hall. He stopped between Naomi, who was still on her knees, and Director Choi, who suddenly looked very small despite her heels. He didn't look at Naomi. He looked solely at Choi, his expression terrifyingly calm. "Director Choi," he said, his voice soft, dangerously so. "You seem to be confused about the hierarchy of this house." He gestured to Naomi without looking down. "She is not a cleaner. She is under my personal employment. And in this house, no one, absolutely no one, disrespects what belongs to me." The possessiveness of the phrase hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. He reached down, offering a hand to Naomi. It was a public declaration, a line drawn in the sand. Naomi hesitated, then took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet, his grip warm and solid against her trembling palm. The incident with Director Choi did exactly what Dae-hyun likely knew it would. It started a firestorm of whispers. By the next morning, the rumors had spread from the household staff to the lower levels of the syndicate and likely out into the city's underbelly. "The boss has a woman. The foreigner. She lives in the house." The stares Naomi received in the hallways became heavier, loaded with speculation and envy. She felt the weight of it pressing on her shoulders, a constant reminder that she was walking on a tightrope over a pit of vipers. She tried to make herself smaller, to disappear into the background, but Dae-hyun made that impossible. He began summoning her more often, inventing tasks that kept her in his office, safe behind the heavy doors where the gossip couldn't reach. It was late one evening, the sky outside the windows pitch black and spitting snow again, when the shift happened, subtle, quiet, but irreversible. They were working late, the only light coming from the desk lamp and the glow of the city below. Naomi was sorting through travel itineraries, shivering slightly as the draft from the window seeped into the room. She didn't say anything, didn't want to disturb the concentration of the man working silently across from her. She rubbed her arms, trying to generate heat, focusing on the paper in front of her. Suddenly, a shadow fell over her desk. She looked up to find Dae-hyun standing there, his suit jacket discarded, wearing a dark gray cashmere sweater that softened the hard lines of his frame. Without a word, he placed a heavy, woolen throw blanket over her shoulders. He didn't drop it. He draped it, his hands lingering for a fraction of a second on the fabric, adjusting it so it covered her fully. The heat radiating from him was palpable, a stark contrast to the cold room. "The heating is inefficient in this wing," he lied smoothly, his voice low in the quiet room. "Do not get sick again. It would be inconvenient for my schedule." It was a dismissal, a framing of care as logistics, but the action betrayed him. He didn't walk away immediately. He stood there, looking down at her, and for the first time, Naomi didn't look down. She looked up, meeting his gaze, seeing the exhaustion and the hidden burden in his dark eyes. "Thank you, Dae-hyun," she whispered, using his name for the first time instead of his title. He stiffened, the sound of his name on her lips seeming to strike him physically. He didn't correct her. He simply turned back to his desk, but he didn't resume working. He sat there, staring at the unlit fireplace, realizing with a dawn of dread and desire that he was no longer just protecting an investment. He was protecting her, and that terrified him more than any bullet ever could. The rumors that had started as a trickle within the household staff soon swelled into a torrent that spilled out into the unforgiving ecosystem of Seoul's elite underworld. It was the night of the Winter Solstice Gala, a mandatory event for the families that controlled the shipping and construction industries, and Dae-hyun had insisted Naomi attend. He claimed it was because he needed an assistant on hand to manage the sensitive introductions, but as she stood in front of the full-length mirror in her quarters, staring at the silver silk gown he had commissioned for her, she knew this was no longer about administrative duty. The dress was a weapon, armor made of moonlight and money, designed to signal to every detractor that she was under his protection. However, when they arrived at the venue, a cavernous ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers and malice, the protection felt fragile against the sheer weight of the collective gaze. Hundreds of eyes turned toward them as they descended the grand staircase, the silence rippling outward from their entrance like a shockwave. Naomi kept her chin high, her hand resting lightly on Dae-hyun's forearm, feeling the tension radiating off him like heat from a furnace. He was rigid, his jaw set in that familiar line of stone, his eyes scanning the crowd not for allies, but for threats. As the night wore on, Dae-hyun was pulled into a high-stakes conversation with a rival faction, leaving Naomi temporarily stranded near the Champagne Tower. It was then that the whispers became audible, cutting through the ambient classical music. "That's her," a woman in red murmured to her companion, making no effort to lower her voice. The stray he picked up from the gutter. "I heard she was homeless," another voice, male and sneering, chimed in. It's a novelty for him. A man like the Silent King doesn't keep pets for long. Once the winter thaws, she'll be back on the street. Naomi's grip on her clutch tightened until her knuckles turned white. The insults weren't new, but hearing them spoken so casually, as if she were an object of curiosity rather than a human being, stung with a fresh, sharp pain. She felt a sudden, suffocating urge to run, to tear off the expensive silk that felt like a lie and flee back to the anonymity of the cold. But she didn't. She remembered the snow, the feeling of dying, and the man who had stopped for her when no one else would. She straightened her spine, took a slow sip of the sparkling water she was holding, and turned to face the gossipers with a cool, detached stare that mirrored Dae-hyun's own. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her bleed. Across the room, Dae-hyun caught her eye, pausing mid-sentence. He saw the steel in her posture, the refusal to crumble, and for a moment, the mask of the Mafia boss slipped, revealing a flash of fierce, burning pride. The drive back to the estate was performed in a heavy, loaded silence, the kind that feels thicker than the steel-reinforced doors of the sedan. The city lights blurred past in streaks of neon and gray, reflecting off the window where Naomi rested her head, exhausted by the emotional labor of existing in his world. When they finally arrived, the house was dark, the staff dismissed for the night. Dae-hyun bypassed the main stairs and headed straight for the kitchen, loosening his tie with a rare expression of fatigue. Naomi followed him, watching as he poured himself a glass of amber liquid, his movements slower than usual. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the sky on his shoulders, his isolation suddenly painful to witness. She moved to the kitchen island, instinctively reaching for the kettle. "You didn't eat," she said softly, her voice breaking the quiet. "The food at those parties is for show, not for sustenance." Dae-hyun looked up, his glass pausing halfway to his lips. "I am not hungry," he lied, the automatic defense of a man who viewed needs as weaknesses. Naomi ignored him. She moved with a quiet efficiency that had become second nature in this house, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator. Eggs, scallions, a bowl of day-old rice. She set a pan on the stove, the soft hiss of the gas burner filling the space with a domestic warmth that felt utterly alien to the sterile luxury of the mansion. Dae-hyun didn't leave. He leaned against the counter, watching her. He watched her hands, no longer trembling as they had weeks ago, chop the vegetables with rhythmic precision. He watched the way a loose curl of hair fell across her forehead and the way she blew it out of her eyes instead of tucking it back because her hands were busy. It was a scene of such profound normalcy that it made his chest ache. When she slid the plate of simple fried rice across the marble counter toward him, steam rising in the cool air, he stared at it as if it were a complex contract. "Eat," she commanded gently, echoing the tone he had used on her that first day in the clinic. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. He sat down on the bar stool, the height difference vanishing as he slumped slightly into the posture of a tired man. He took a bite, then another, the silence between them shifting from heavy to intimate. Naomi stood on the other side of the island, a safe distance that felt increasingly like a magnetic field she was struggling to resist. "They were cruel tonight," Dae-hyun said suddenly, not looking up from the plate. "I heard them." Naomi's breath hitched. "It doesn't matter," she replied, though her voice wavered. "It matters to me," he said, the words low and rough. He looked up then, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that stripped away the air in the room. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers on the cool marble, not quite touching, the heat between their skin electric. "I possess the power to silence them all," he whispered, "but I find that what I want more than their silence is for you to be okay." It was the closest he had ever come to admitting that she was more than a debt to be collected. The library was the heart of the house, a sanctuary of leather and old paper where Dae-hyun usually retreated to bury himself in the violence of his business, but tonight, the violence was internal. It had been 3 days since the gala, 3 days of a simmering tension that made every accidental brush of their arms in the hallway feel like a lightning strike. A storm was raging outside, battering the glass walls with sheets of freezing rain, mirroring the turmoil inside him. Naomi had entered to deliver a stack of finalized contracts, intending to leave immediately, but the atmosphere in the room held her in place. Dae-hyun was standing by the window, staring out into the black abyss of the city, his reflection ghostly against the glass. He didn't turn when she entered, but she knew he was hyper-aware of her presence. The air in the room seemed to tighten around them. "You should go to bed, Naomi," he said, his voice strained, lacking its usual authoritative cadence. "It is late." Naomi placed the folder on the desk but didn't retreat. The distance between them felt wrong, a gap that needed to be bridged. "You're bleeding," she said quietly. It was a metaphor, but also a literal truth. He had cut his hand earlier on a shattered glass in a moment of frustration he hadn't explained, and the bandage was seeping red. She walked toward him, ignoring the warning tension in his shoulders. "Let me change the dressing." Dae-hyun finally turned, his face a mask of conflict. "It is a scratch," he dismissed, trying to step away, but he was backed against the window. Naomi reached out, taking his damaged hand in hers. Her fingers were warm, her touch gentle but firm, and the contact shattered his resolve. He stopped pulling away. He looked down at her, at the top of her head, at the way her eyelashes cast shadows on her cheeks, and he felt the walls of his fortress crumbling. "Why do you stay?" he asked, the question torn from him. "You have worked off your debt. The numbers are balanced. You could leave. I could give you a ticket to anywhere." Naomi looked up, her eyes clear and unyielding, holding his gaze with a bravery that humbled him. "I don't want to go anywhere," she confessed, her voice a whisper that roared in the silence. "I'm not here for the debt anymore, Dae-hyun. I haven't been for a long time." The confession hung in the air, terrified and beautiful. Dae-hyun closed his eyes for a second, a look of pained longing crossing his face, before he stepped closer, invading her space, his good hand coming up to cup her jaw. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, a touch of reverence. "You are dangerous," he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "You make me forget that I am supposed to be made of ice. You make me want things I cannot have." Naomi leaned into his touch, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the heavy, rapid thud of his heart. "Maybe you're not supposed to be ice," she countered. "Maybe you're just a man." The kiss, when it came, was not a cinematic crash, but a slow, desperate surrender, a melting of two frozen worlds into one, fueled by the heat of a winter that was finally ending. The fragile bubble of their private world was pierced the following morning by the arrival of Chairman Kong, Dae-hyun's uncle and the true patriarch of the syndicate's old guard. He arrived not with an entourage, but alone, which was infinitely more terrifying. He sat in the main reception room, a man of withered skin and eyes like polished obsidian, drinking tea with a calm that suggested he had already decided the execution date. Naomi was summoned not by Daehyun, but by the chairman himself. When she entered the room, Daehyun was already there, standing by the fireplace, his body rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked like a man being restrained by invisible chains. The chairman gestured for Naomi to sit, pushing a small, elegant envelope across the low table toward her. It was heavy, creamy paper, the kind used for wedding invitations or death notices. "My nephew has a weakness for stray things," the chairman began, his voice dry and crackling like autumn leaves. "He believes he is saving you. But in our world, affection is a target on your back." He tapped the envelope with a manicured fingernail. "Inside is a check for an amount that will allow you to live like a queen in any country of your choosing. Except this one. You will leave today. You will never contact him again. And in exchange, he will remain the head of this family, secure and unchallenged." Naomi looked at the envelope, then at Daehyun. His eyes were burning with a plea, not for her to stay, but for her to be safe. He was willing to let her go to save her from the toxicity of his bloodline. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He loved her enough to lose her. Naomi reached for the envelope. The chairman smiled, a thin, triumphant expression. But instead of opening it, Naomi picked it up and slowly, deliberately, tore it in half. Then in half again. The sound of the tearing paper was the loudest noise in the room. She placed the pieces gently in the ashtray. "I am not a stray," she said, her voice shaking slightly but gaining strength with every word. "And I am not for sale. I didn't survive the cold and the hunger just to be bought off by a bully in a suit." She turned to Daehyun, ignoring the chairman completely. "I stay because I choose to. If that costs him his crown, then maybe the crown isn't worth wearing." The chairman stood up, his face purple with rage, but before he could speak, Daehyun moved. He crossed the room in 2 strides, placing himself between Naomi and his uncle, a human shield of broad shoulders and absolute resolve. "She stays," Daehyun said, his voice flat and final, the tone of a king delivering a verdict. "And if you try to remove her, you'll find that the loyalty of the men outside belongs to me, not to the ghosts of the past. The era of the Silent King is over. I am speaking now." The standoff with the chairman did not end in violence, but in a tense, bureaucratic retreat. The old man, realizing that the syndicate's younger generation was fiercely loyal to Daehyun, and by extension, the woman who had humanized him, withdrew to the countryside estates, leaving a vacuum of power that Daehyun filled with a new kind of authority. But the true resolution didn't happen in the boardroom. It happened weeks later, on the first day of true spring. The snow that had defined their meeting had finally melted, revealing the gray concrete and the green shoots of life pushing through the cracks of the city. Daehyun asked Naomi to walk with him, not to a gala or a meeting, but to the very spot outside the Grand Hyatt where she had fallen. They stood there, the valet stand busy with the evening rush, the air crisp but no longer biting. Daehyun wore a coat, but this time, he wasn't looking past the crowd. He was part of it. He turned to Naomi, who was wearing a coat he had bought her, warm, wool, and vibrant red, a color of life and passion. He took both her hands in his, ignoring the paparazzi who were beginning to realize who was standing on the sidewalk. "I spent my life building walls to keep the cold out," Daehyun said, his voice steady, audible to anyone who cared to listen. "I thought safety meant being alone. I was wrong." He reached into his pocket, not for a ring. That would come later in private, but for a simple, light blue silk scarf that matched the blouse she had worn that first night. He wrapped it around her neck, tying it with a gentleness that defied his reputation. "You saved me," Naomi whispered, tears pricking her eyes as she remembered the despair of that night. Daehyun shook his head, a genuine smile breaking the marble mask of his face, transforming him into something younger, something lighter. "No," he corrected her, pulling her close, his forehead resting against hers in full view of the world. "You were the one who saved me. I just provided the car." He kissed her then, not a hidden, desperate thing in a dark library, but a public claim, a declaration that the king had chosen his queen, and that for the first time in the history of the Kong Syndicate, Love was not a weakness to be exploited, but the greatest strength of all.